countries are clearly deprioritizing education. So some countries, and low-income countries in particular, have increased spending, but this is a very small group. There are 1/4 more students in schools and universities in 2023 than there were in 2015. These are incredibly fast rates of expansion of the systems. Enrollment levels have increased by 10%, also quite considerable, and yet deprioritization of education is rapid. Now, what's going on there?
Welcome to WISE on Air, where we talk to the world's leading mind on the future of education. I am your host, Selma Talha-Jebril, WISE Research and Policy Director, and in this episode, we are tackling one of the most pressing challenges in education, leadership and education investments. The 2024-25 Global Education Monitoring Report, Lead for Learning, released last October, shines a spotlight on the critical role of leadership in reversing stalling global education progress. At the same time, UNESCO and the World Bank's Education Finance Watch 2024 reveals alarming disparities in education investment. For every $100 spent per child in high-income countries, less than $1 reaches children in low-income nations. With aid to education declining and debt servicing costs soaring, the stakes for achieving Sustainable Development Goals 4 couldn't be higher. The GEM reports highlight the transformative power of leadership at every level, from ministries to schools. Strong leaders account for over a quarter of the variation in school performance. Yet, shockingly, only half of school principals globally receive adequate training. These leaders are overwhelmed by administrative burdens, leaving little time to focus on improving teaching and learning outcomes. In today's conversation, I'm honored to be joined by Manos Antoninis, the author of the 24-25 GEM report. We'll explore how bold leadership and smarter investments can transform education systems and what it takes to build a future where every child, regardless of where they are born, has access to quality education. Well, let's dive in. Manos, welcome. It's great to have you on the show again.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. So let's start with stagnation in global education progress. The GEM reports highlight that global progress in education has stalled, with minimal reduction in out-of-school population and declines in adolescent literacy. In your view, what are the key barriers preventing more significant progress, and how can leadership at all levels help overcome these challenges?
Well, first of all, let me say that the Global Education Monitoring Report had the mandate to update the international community on progress towards the International Education Goal, SDG 4. And we're publishing this report. I'm not the only author, I'm just one of many. I'm directing the reports, and we have the obligation to give the pulse of where the world stands vis-a-vis the very ambitious targets that were set in 2015 for 2030. Now, we had, as we all know, the COVID pandemic, which for a couple of years tortured education systems. School closures may well be one of the biggest consequences of that pandemic because they appear to have had an impact on a number of education dimensions. Let's start, of course, with the out-of-school numbers. This does not appear yet to have been a major consequence of COVID. In the grand scheme of things, children go to school, and there is a universal tendency to increase the number of children enrolled in schools. And it's true that since 2015, if we also take into account the demographic developments, there are more than 100 million children and young people who are in schools than there were at the beginning of this period. But given that there is, as I said, demographic change, in terms of rates of children still not going to school, the progress has been very, very low, almost stagnant. And that was a trend that was observed already in the early 2010s. COVID does not seem to have made that worse. But overall, this is a major finding. Now, the reasons for that are multiple. Let me turn to the second finding, which is perhaps more novel because it is more difficult to observe. We only have the opportunity to get data on learning outcomes every 3 to 4 years, and that was also particularly disrupted during COVID. And also, we do see that COVID must have played an important role. But in upper middle and high income countries, we do observe that since 2012, let's say, in the last 10 years, the percentage of adolescents who achieve a minimum proficiency has fallen in reading by 12 percentage points from the high 60s to the below mid 50% of the student population. And that's a major fall. We do tend to talk about the learning crisis for the world's poorest countries where learning levels are very low. But here we have a real crisis because learning levels are actually falling and falling quite rapidly. Now, what are the reasons for that? Unfortunately, in the case of reading, because we have also a fall in mathematics, a bit smaller, maybe 7 percentage points. In the case of reading, the decline started in 2010. And that raises big questions for all of us. Yes, COVID seems to have had an impact, additional impact, but there are other factors that have been going on for a long time, and here we can only speculate. We hope to be able to have more information in the coming years, but it is inevitable to at least assume that the growing impact of technology, and not necessarily the technology in the classroom, but technology overall, the impact it has on how young people choose to spend their time, and the impact it has perhaps on their ability to read and understand and interpret text, seems to have been negative. And that's a major concern because, of course, so much hope has been placed on technology, and yet we see that maybe it's having the opposite effect. There are also potentially other reasons. I think the pace of modern life, the time maybe parents have to give to their children compared to maybe the previous generation may also be a challenge. These are really big questions. We can only speculate. I think it's very difficult to say something concrete, but it really is a cause for concern.
It is, unfortunately. Well, I mean, COVID might have exacerbated some of these challenges. It's very obvious and clear that they are rooted in system level and what needs to be changed. So let me go to the second question that tackles the role of school leaders in improving learning outcomes. The reports emphasize the critical role of school leaders in driving improvement in teaching and learning. Given the findings on the lack of leadership training and excessive administrative burdens, what actionable steps can government and policymakers, Manos, take on to empower school leaders to lead for learning in an effective way?
The report deals with leaders at all levels, at the school level, inside the school, because there's so many people that formally or informally also have leadership positions, teachers and others. At the system level, that means all the civil servants who are responsible for implementing government programs and reforms at the local government and at the central government level. And we also have the third level, which we call at the political level. And of course, politicians, ministers of education, parliamentarians are the first people that come to people's minds, but there are also many other potential and actual leaders. There are those who represent interest groups with a stake in education, students, teacher unions, business associations. There are also those who help society form its view on the direction of the education system. And by that, we have international organizations, we have intellectuals, we have academics and researchers. But we also have those who help hold politicians to account for commitments they have made. And here we have in mind civil society and the media. There are so many actors that help form the direction of the education system, what people aspire for. And I think this is really important and we tend to forget. Now, of all those people, of course, the majority thinks of school leaders as the key actors in an education system, because change happens in the classroom, happens in the schoolyard, happens in the school community. And it's the accumulation of small changes at that level that really makes the difference. And it's true that in the last decades, there has been a major shift in the way we view the role of the school leader. And the school leader was supposed to be an administrator, dealing with the day-to-day things that happen in school. However, increasingly, with a growing emphasis on the purpose of school being improved learning, and that's also a little bit of an interesting and perhaps slightly controversial issue, because schools deliver so many more things than just learning outcomes, but at least through the emphasis on learning, especially in those countries that hold schools to account for improvements in learning outcomes, and it's a growing number of them that do that. There has been a shift in our thinking about the role of the school leader as someone who catalyzes changes in teaching practices and in the attention the school community places on how children can learn better. Has the preparation of leaders been appropriate for that? Has it been sufficient? No. And you asked about the factors that can play a role. There are many. How we select teachers, and the report shows that often the selection of teachers is not necessarily meritocratic. It's based on a range of other criteria that may get in the way of selecting the best. It's also how we prepare. And just to give an example, even in the world's richer countries, fewer than half of teachers get training for school management before they join the school. Very few get support as they start, and programs that help them develop professionally are actually not necessarily very well focused on what matters most for their progress. So there is a range of things that still governments are grappling with if they really are to support teachers to live up to the promise and the responsibilities they have assigned to them.
So considering the many players, as you just mentioned, that are involved in contributing to the systemic change, Manos, what are some of the strategies that can be implemented to ensure that both education ministers and system leaders have the tools to be able to support the needs to drive long-term reforms, and especially given the high turnover rates of education ministers, as we've seen it in the reports?
You're right. We have carried out a very interesting analysis of ministerial tenures. It is seen that since 2010, the average minister stays in their office for 2 years and 3 months. By the end of 2 years, 51% of ministers are no longer in post. And in countries that have political systems driven by liberal electoral approaches, the average tenure is even lower, 1 year and 11 months. These are, of course, extremely short periods, as we all know from our work, to implement a consistent and coherent program and deliver results, which, as we know in education, takes such a long time. Now, what can be done? It is very difficult to say at that level what can be done. I think ministers, as politicians, need to develop a culture of consensus, a listening culture, not to rush to leave the stamp, because often ambitious ideas don't end up being absorbed, maybe more disruptive in the negative sense than necessarily constructive and leaving a legacy behind. So it is important for ministers to be flexible, to understand that they need to get everyone together to move in a particular direction. And of course, there are many different ways of bringing change. But I think more generally, and the report emphasizes that, is alongside the emphasis on head teachers as those people who can help deliver improvement in learning, there has also been a tendency to move away from the popular imagination we have of leaders as these charismatic people that really help bring the change that only they and nobody else can do. In reality, many people work together to bring change. And I think this is what matters also from the report's perspective, we need to agree that there are a few key aspects that effective leaders can bring to their work, and that is that they set expectations, so they have a vision for that, that they focus on learning. This is important, even though the definition of what is learning can be broadened. What we call instructional leadership is very important. The third is the need to collaborate and share their tasks with others in a collaborative way. And the fourth is to remain focused also on developing people. Of course, they develop students, but they also need to develop their teams. Now, education systems need to make sure, because only with systemic change can we see difference, that these four dimensions are addressed in the way people are selected for jobs. And that applies not only to school leaders, but also system leaders. So all those civil servants I was mentioning earlier with responsibility for implementing reform, but also their preparation and professional development programs.
Okay, so let us touch base on, at the policy level, what role does autonomy play in improving school performance, and how can more countries adopt policies that gives leader greater control over academic and organizational decisions?
Well, that's a very, very important question. Let's start by saying that school leaders and other leaders, system leaders, operate, of course, around the world in a very different contexts. And school leaders are expected to deliver on their basic expectations, whether they work in a centralized system or in a decentralized system. But having said that, there is now growing consensus that the more opportunities school leaders have and system leaders to take initiative, to be responsible for a broader range of decisions than in tightly controlled centralized system, the more opportunities they have to exercise their leadership functions and make a difference. And it's true that in a cross-section of countries, education systems with more autonomy do appear to have higher learning outcomes, at least, for example, in mathematics, based on international assessments that collect information, not only on learning, but also on characteristics of the education system. Of course, such changes happen quite slowly when it comes to decisions for giving autonomy to system leaders, because they are, as I said, civil servants, and civil service administration reform is usually a much more slow process. But it is important to remember that there are some centralized systems that actually select people for these positions not on the basis of expertise, but on the basis or expertise in the subject matter of work, but in terms of their expertise in running a public office, a local government office, for example. South Asia is one example that has that tradition. And it is interesting because you see civil servants in really very sensitive positions, and yet they have no particular expertise in the education sector. In fact, they tend to move between sectors. One day they're in education, the next day they're in fisheries, and the third day they might be in infrastructure projects. So you really start asking, well, how can we expect change in as technically sophisticated area as education if people don't know much about that? So there are questions here that require attention, and they vary in every part of the world depending on their traditions of governance.
So Manos, one aspect that we've touched upon, and I just want to go back to it, we've discussed that school leaders need better support with administrative responsibilities, right? And also so that they can support the teaching and learning outcomes. Do you think AI could be an enabler to support with a reduced workload when it comes to administrative responsibilities?
Well, of course, the range of tasks that people have at that level is quite bewildering and very, very extensive. There's a nice study from one of our partners, Global School Leaders, that estimated that more than 2/3 of the time is spent on administrative tasks in the range of 14 middle-income countries around the world. We also observe that even in high-income countries, the amount of time that head teachers are spending on their instructional leadership tasks, on supervising or providing feedback, actually has been declining. And that's the result of more and more responsibilities being assigned to them, administrative and others. So there is a cause for concern. Now, AI depends what we mean. Of course, we know that, for example, in some systems, teachers may be using it to check the quality of students' essays, for example, just to make an example. That doesn't apply directly to the case of school leaders or people who are in such positions that have to take very different decisions. It's true that perhaps one could say that some of the administrative work could be eased with careful use of technology, but and not necessarily AI, but generally digital technology and the opportunities it offers. But it's also true, and we should not forget, that at the moment, many school leaders do complain that the presence of more technology tools actually does not seem to reduce their workload on that front. Rather, it may be ending up increasing it because people think it's easier to now collect more information and report it with the new tools. But that means more and more work of that kind is added. So a lot of thought needs to go into this, because unfortunately, technology does not seem to liberate us as much as we had hoped.
Thank you for highlighting that. Very insightful indeed. So let's now move on to the Education Finance Watch 2024 report. The report highlights a 155-fold disparity in per child education spending between high and low income countries. How can global financial systems be reformed to address this inequity?
Well, it is, of course, a very impressive contrast between high and low income countries. There are two sides to that. If we translate that in absolute dollar terms, it is true. Low income countries spend, let's say, between $50 and $200, depending on the case, per student per year in basic education. And high income countries spend $8,000 on average, some countries more. Clearly, even if we adapt for salaries of teachers, the cost of delivering education, etc., the difference is huge. No one can realistically expect to improve learning outcomes of children that already in poorer countries face so many other difficulties and disadvantages with such amounts of spending. At the same time, we should also be cautious in how we interpret these numbers in terms of percentage of the spending as a share of per capita income in low and high income countries. The differences are not very big. Low income countries spend just a little bit below what high income countries spend. So about 13-14%, whereas perhaps high income countries may be spending 16%. So the difference is not that big. It's not as if we can suddenly offload a bucket full of money in poor countries and suddenly their education system would transform, because they don't have the capacity to spend so much more. But we do know that there is scope to spend more on education and to spend it wisely to have the impact, because we also have studies that show that at those low levels of spending, doubling the amount that countries and students receive per capita can have a dramatic impact on learning outcomes, because you can break some of the biggest obstacles that schools in those countries face.
So then, what are some of the concrete actions the government can take to mitigate the debt pressures that we are diverting resources away from education in low-income countries?
Well,
what can be done?
That is a different question, and I think that's perhaps the even more interesting finding of the Education Finance Watch, and one actually that really has been supported by the preparation of the Education Finance Watch, because we've tried quite consciously and consistently over the last couple of years to give a global picture of what countries spend, because often data coming from different countries comes with a range of gaps, and we have worked systematically to fill the gaps and get the long-term perspective. And here we find that since the early 2010s, let's say at least since 2015, the percentage of countries' GDP that is spent on education has fallen by 0.3 to 0.4 percentage points. So it used to be a little bit over 4%, and now it's closer to 4%. But even more worryingly, the percentage of the budgets that is spent on education has fallen even more by about 0.6 to 0.7 percentage points. It has now perhaps gone even below 13%. And that is the big cause of concern. Countries are clearly deprioritizing education. So some countries, and low-income countries in particular, have increased spending, but this is a very small group of countries, and it is inevitable because their education systems are growing very, very rapidly. In low-income countries, there are 1/4 more students in schools and universities in 2023 than there were in 2015. These are incredibly fast rates of expansion of the systems, primarily because of the demographic change, but also due to the increase of education that is happening there. But in middle-income countries, enrollment levels have increased by 10%, also quite considerable, and yet the deprioritization of education is rapid. Now, what's going on there? Of course, we had the COVID crisis that may have diverted resources. We have the overall global changes due to war, due to the social spending that had to happen to deal with the consequences, inflation, trade obstacles, a range of factors. All of those together, and it depends by country, have increased pressure on countries to spend more. Countries have borrowed, but the situation is adverse. So the levels of borrowing, the cost of borrowing has increased. And as a result, some countries are really rapidly falling into debt distress. This is a trend that has been already addressed in our previous report. So inevitably, education is one of the sectors that is most likely to bear the burden of that. And the question is, what do we do? Well, it is very complicated. It's not as if there's any easy solution. What the report does is to remind us that the situation is not as extreme yet as it was in the 1980s, when the major debt crisis really had dramatic effects on social spending in low and middle income countries. That debt crisis, we tend to forget, but it's really important, and I should stress it, led, for example, in Africa, to levels of primary completion rates to stagnate between 1984 and 2003. For 20 years, completion rates did not increase in Africa and remained at about 60%. That's an incredibly strong impact. It came as a result of structural adjustment programs, pressure on government spending to decline to accommodate the crisis. But international donors and international financing was quite insensitive into the consequences of doing that so rapidly. And the report says we really need to be very careful not to repeat this exercise, because at that time, the international community acted very slowly. This time, we need to learn from that quite tragic mistake and not allow it to happen again. Unfortunately, on the debt situation, things are not as simple as they were 40 years ago, because now the debt burden is shared by many more actors, and not only public, but also private, and it's not as easy to negotiate solutions out of this. So that's, of course, a problem that goes outside education, but we are obliged to report and bring attention of what happened in the past to take lessons for the future.
So an additional question on education expenditure. We know that some countries, I know we tend to, put regions in pockets. And I think in the case of Africa, it's important to nuance the different education expenditures that are taking place in the continent and other parts of the world where actually education investments have gone up in recent years. And I just wonder to what extent we're also looking at what are the enablers in those countries that were able, despite all of the social unrest, the wars, and the inflation, and all of the other factors that you just mentioned, they were able to actually increase the education investments, and what can be learned from those countries. Can you touch a word on this?
I mean, just first of all, to contest that spending on education is going down globally. It's hardly possible to speak of a region that is spending more on education now than they used to before. So the problem is global. But you're right that individual countries do make a difference. I don't think it adds to a regional pattern or a global pattern. On the contrary, I think it's a clear message of the Education Finance Watch. Spending levels are going down. Now, what countries can do, there's only one answer to that. The spending levels can only increase if you increase the size of the pie, as we say, and countries need to have more resources. And it's true that for many middle-income countries that aspire to expand their education systems, the rate of progress in domestic resource mobilization is quite disappointingly slow. So countries need efficient tax collection systems that are fair and collect resources from where they come, not unfairly burdening some parts of the population and benefiting others. I think the investment in tax systems that can be so much more efficient sometimes than even investments in education, because in the long term they can have impact that is really dramatic on social spending. So this is the one priority. Countries need to tackle their domestic resource mobilization efforts, and yet we know that politically many governments, for whatever reasons, find that difficult. Of course, there are possibilities to make some spending more efficient. There are some countries, richer countries, where there's more scope to have more equitable spending. There is room for maneuver there to make sure that those who need investment most get it. But the core answer, the core solution is better tax systems.
Thank you, Manu. So now that we've touched upon what government can do to mitigate the debt pressure, what is the role of the international organizations as well as the private sector to collaborate closely and then hopefully find a solution to the funding gap that currently is standing at $100 billion annual dollar? What can be done?
The interesting point is we're talking about how governments deprioritize education due to the pressures, fiscal pressures they're facing. But interestingly enough, international donors are also deprioritizing education. Now, let's put things in perspective. The average country spends about 15%, let's say, I was saying earlier, of their budget on education. Poorer countries tend to spend a little bit more than that, inevitably. But that includes salaries, and that's the main cost of education in most countries. International donors do not fund salaries. They invest in areas that help expand the potential of countries in delivering better education, so quality investments, generally speaking. But the percentage of donor budgets that is going to education has declined since 2019 from 9.3% to 7.6% in 2022. And the question here, there are many questions there to be asked, is why is it going down? And I think there are a number of factors. First of all, the aid environment is changing. There's less and less emphasis on grants, money that comes for free to the poorer countries. And unfortunately, education is much more reliant on grants than any other sector of aid spending. So that's one problem. Secondly, there are, of course, new pressures in recent years, and maybe also the green transition that countries need to go through means there's more demand for investment in energy, for example, that also comes at the detriment of education. But the most important factor, in my view, is, I think, a misperception of how education systems work. There is a tendency globally when it comes to many government spending systems, which include education, to focus on the idea of results. We need to invest where there are results, where we have proven that an investment delivers a particular outcome in a particular period of time. Unfortunately, education is not very suited. Health is a sector where you can do that. You invest in a vaccine, you know that 3 years later, public health will have improved. In education, there are no vaccines. You need to invest in institutions, stronger institutions. And unfortunately, that's a big message for me, is that this has fallen out of fashion because you cannot observe changes in institutions in 3 years. This is something that requires sustained efforts and assume responsibility for how you design these projects. And unfortunately, this has fallen out of fashion. And I expect that education will continue being deprioritized even in education portfolios, because people no longer put the energy and the thinking that is required. They just want quick results for everything, and that is not in the favor of education.
So, Manos, you mentioned that one of the reasons that we are witnessing a fall in aid, and particularly, again, just to highlight the number, we went from a 9.3% to 7.6% between 2019 and 2022. You said it's because the way we do aid has changed. Isn't actually that a good thing, that we are making nations less reliant on aid's money, and maybe in a way this is putting more pressure on governments?
Well, these are, I think, two different things. Yes, the one thing is that aid is becoming less and less relevant because poorer countries are growing faster than richer countries. So if richer countries maintain the emphasis on aid they have been putting all along, and generally speaking, in the past 25 years, the spending levels on aid as a percentage of rich countries' income has remained more or less the same. So it's not getting worse, it's just the same, but because poor countries are growing faster, then the impact this has on their budget is becoming smaller. It's a natural mechanical process. But that does not and should not prevent the discussion of how such aid can be better. So I would say, let's not confuse the two. We have it, it's still there. It needs to be spent in a way that is effective. And I think that these were the points I was raising. If you really want to continue investing in education, invest in a sensible way. Unfortunately, the tendency is to focus on quick results. So what countries, rich countries do is that they design projects that begin in day one and end in day 100, and something has to be achieved by that time that is measurable, and the spending dollars of aid can be justified. But that's, as I was saying, not the right approach, because countries need technical support, need institutions, and changes need to be very long-term to have an impact. So that requires a very different approach. In fact, we are doing aid differently, but that's not a good thing. The way it's being done is actually at the detriment of the results that we really want to see.
Thank you very much, Manos. It was a pleasure to speak with you again and learn about more about some of the main findings from the latest GEM reports. Any final thoughts? I know we have painted a quite dire situation of education leadership and education investment, but any final thoughts that we can conclude this episode with today?
Well, as I mentioned before, there are 4 important dimensions for what good leadership stands. It means people who are prepared to set expectations, focus on learning, develop people, and be prepared to listen and work with others. Now, these are 4 important dimensions that unfortunately our leader preparation and development systems are not emphasizing enough. And also the way we attract people to these positions may not be necessarily the best, the most suited one to bring those people with the real talents, because often such talents need not be in people who are impressive and On the contrary, you may want people underspoken, understated, who actually know what matters. And if they are allowed to work in good working conditions, they may be able to bring the best of their schools. So more thinking needs to happen there, because it is at the school level that ultimately, at the end of the day, we will see the change we want. And the change is in so many dimensions. We need to have schools that are inclusive, that are preparing students to be sensitive towards others, towards the planet. That requires, of course, so many more talents in our leaders to be able to see the changes and not to simply follow a rule book, but think more broadly about the needs of our young generations.
Well, I sincerely hope that next time we speak, that many of the recommendations and the insight that you've just shared will probably be able to report in a positive way on those. Thank you, Manos, for your time. It was a great speaking to you.
Thanks so much.